Yeah.
on the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
A separate one.
Student.
And blaming.
It has to be in the bloopers part.
Yeah.
Student almost dies. Student almost dies.
Yeah, and then the sound of wrestling and fighting and
Yes.
shouting. Oh. So we're looking at Heart of Darkness once again, and I want to go more specifically through the text this time. We talked about some of the themes last time, and one of the questions I asked was what the Heart of Darkness was even was, and one of the possibilities is simply the darkness on the map, and that obviously is a matter then of intrigue for anyone who likes to explore. And Marlo, when he was a boy, liked to explore. So the idea of looking on the map and seeing that there's a spot on the world where nobody's ever gone before, that's interesting to him as a young boy. But as the novel progresses, there is a sense that there's a deeper sense of darkness, and it's brought to the fore right at the outset. When he says, and this, in reference to London, one of the light places of the world, the most enlightened and the most advanced, this also was once one of the dark places of the earth. So it adds another layer to it. And then we get to the center of the Congo when he finally goes there to take care of Kurtz, the problem that Kurtz was, the effect of being in Africa upon the so-called civilized people. How do they act with power at their disposal and no restraint on their actions? And so there's a figure in the 19th century by the name of Lord Acton, and he uses this phrase which you will have heard. Power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely. And it's addressing the depravity, I think, within the human heart as much as anything, and the possibility that technology affords to people to do things that they could not do before. And although it's not really the centerpiece of the Heart of Darkness, that is the problem of technology and civilization per se, it's going down that route and talking about the advancements that come through technology and the power that comes through technology, but which in a way advances our humanity and in a way detracts from it. And the advances in terms of power and the regresses in terms of moral character. And it's almost there's almost a correlation. The greater the power, the greater the immorality. And that story is also told in Frankenstein, which I'm not teaching on this course. I've taught in courses past, in years past. And I do it, and I still do it in a couple of courses, so that's why I'm not doing it on this course. But in that one, you'll know the story of Frankenstein. He brings a dead corpse or parts of corpses to life in the form of the creature. And so then it introduces the idea of how technology aids us and also debilitates. Because if you think about it, the power of technology, I'm recording this, which goes on the internet, which can be watched all over the world, and it could be done simultaneously even, is an extraordinary power. But anyone who's done any research into the effect of technology on this will also notice that technology is like let's say like a crutch. When you break a leg, you use a crutch to aid you. But if you repeatedly use the crutch, and never stop using the crutch, your leg's never going to be able to hold your weight. And I think the same thing goes for the uses of technology in general. It is of use, but it replaces something which you ought to have and never then develop. And one of the things you never develop is capacity for moral judgment, because those little difficult details of negotiating things and dealing with the problems of people, you can circumvent them through technology. And that seems like great, it solves a lot of problems, and then we see actually the technology has gone way ahead of the ethics and then the ethics try to catch up after the disaster's already happened. And I think Heart of Darkness is, although it's not explicitly commenting on that, on technology, it is talking about efficiency, and technology, that's one of the great benefits of technology, is greater efficiency. So I just heard an interesting lecture from a business candidate on something called a solar ship being built in Brantford. These are like, I don't know if it's helium, I think it's a helium, like a dirigible, and it's not unmanned. It's a ship, so you can carry supplies to areas that, and it doesn't even need to land on a landing strip. It can land in a soccer field. So obviously it can carry supplies to very dangerous places, and solely through solar power. So very interesting. The advantages are obvious. What are the disadvantages? They don't seem obvious, actually. At least not at first blush. And then something will happen that'll make it problematic, like the recent crashes with the A37s or whatever, where there's a computer glitch, right? And everyone's exploring driverless cars and what could possibly go wrong, and I'm thinking, this is never going to happen. And I've been told repeatedly that I'm wrong, that it is going to happen. And I'm saying, well, I would never want to give myself over to a driverless car. I'm sorry. Yes. Exactly.
With the idea of ethics sort of following technology or following the problems that come up, isn't that the way it has to happen? That you, like, you...
Yes, I don't think there's any way of circumventing it, because ethics relates to living in the world as we experience it.
Mm-hmm.
But if technology changes the world as we experience it, then ethics is going to follow that.
Mm-hmm. But there's no way to have ethics first.
There is, if the world is not fundamentally different. If it's fundamentally the same, then you can have a stable ethics that will apply in every situation. But if the technology is changing the conditions of humanity, not just in a little way, like you can use a tractor instead of a horse for plowing your field, but in the sense that you can use technologies of, you know, antibiotics and so forth to deal with the problems of disease and so forth, but now you're affecting the environment. That's a different sort of shift. And then you get into the human sphere, and Heart of Darkness does deal with this, is what's the effect of European settlers going to a country or a continent where they have extraordinary power that is like magical to the inhabitants. They have guns, you know, you point a stick and you can shoot somebody from a long distance, makes a loud bang, and somebody's dead over there. And they're coming on a ship without anybody rowing. There's no sail, there's no row. So these are all extraordinary things. How do we relate to these people? They seem to have powers that are godlike in some ways. Well, that hasn't changed. The effect of people with technology and their encounter with people without it. But what do people then do with that? So the godlike powers of technology are not matched by godlike ethical capacities. In fact, it's the exact opposite. They have more power, and there are no impediments to their use of that power, and so they do it, and then they do it to their own advantage, and they do it for the purposes of exploitation. And we see the man Kurtz starts executing people who oppose him, and the inhabitants are okay with that. And we being the Europeans, who are Conrad's audience here, are appalled by it, but on the other hand, it's entirely understandable that it would happen. And then so he's asking questions there, and so the novella, to my mind, is, I don't think it's a black and white novel in the sense it doesn't come down on, the Europeans are the bad guys or the Africans are the bad. It's not the good and the bad. It's more talking about the problem of the human condition with limitless power and what will happen in the light of that. So there's an assumption that technology has brought an advance in the human race. So we live in an enlightened, or at least in the age of progress. People still talk about this. And by the way, this is the age of progress. up until the First World War, there's almost a euphoric sense in Europe that we live in a golden age. I talked about that already. And in which, we can do things that had never been done in the past. And humanity is advancing to the point where we're putting nature under our feet, as it were. Yeah, and so being able to circumvent natural obstacles. Eventually, it will lead to airplanes and so forth. We can fly, which is only dreamt of in the past. But with that power, there's a use of that power without any sense of what would be the right way to use it and where ought we not to use it. And that expands when human nature itself gets looked on as something to be colonized. Now, he doesn't go into that in the novel or novella here specifically, but that then becomes one of the topics of the 20th century in terms of ethics, is the human body as something to be taken control of and studied and mastered. So birth control, which becomes a political issue, is really about the control of life when it begins. So it's something we gain power over, right? And eugenics, which also is in and around this time. Theories of race, and which is the superior race. Like if Darwinist evolution is true, then which of the races, as they encounter them, is the one that is evolving, and which are the ones that are retrograde in some ways? That's a live question in this era. And it certainly becomes so by the mid-20th century in Nazi Germany and so forth. But not only there, in North America and throughout Europe, they have eugenics movements. You know what I mean by eugenics? The EU here refers to the betterment of the gene. So to make the human body a better thing, or the human person a better thing, through technology, through selective breeding. So allowing these people to have children and preventing those people from having children. If they have diseases, don't let them have kids. If they have even defective eyes, well, if we can't switch that gene off, we'll prevent them from breathing, so that we create people who don't have the defects of human nature. So it's gaining power over nature through technology, and you do that in many ways. So it's a colonization of human nature. That becomes a bigger and bigger topic as the 20th century advances. But it begins in this period. And the Africans here are largely regarded as, that they're not human, which is, I mentioned Chinua Achebe's critique of this. He says that, this is colonialism, and there's a racism inherent and so forth. I think, yeah, there is that, but you're sort of missing the point. Because he is critiquing the European powers, and it's not really about African versus European. It's really about a vantage point towards human nature. And the heart of darkness is, I think, in the midst of Kurtz. But it's not only in Kurtz, it's also in Marlow, who sympathizes with Kurtz and admires his efficiency and sees him as different than the Romans, who also did the same thing at one point, but were more devoted to efficiency than they were. And he thinks that's a good thing. But I don't think his reader, namely us, or whoever his intended audience 100 years ago was, we're not supposed to feel comfortable with his conclusions. We're supposed to regard his view as suspicious. That's intentional. So you're not supposed to come out of this thinking he's right. It's, not so sure about this. Yes? Well, the project of the Enlightenment is to always promote efficiency. That's the means of enlightenment, to get rid of prejudice. Those are the things that hold us back. To emancipate us from, first of all, the past, but also authority in the name of, again, this word, autonomy. or enlightened self-interest, as it's sometimes, that's the purpose of it. And in the end, the human body itself becomes an impediment, as it is conceived in our day. Yes?
For the eugenics, if they're pursuing eugenics, is it kind of contradictory to what Darwin kind of stood for? Because he kind of believed that
It
was
happens
like a
blindly
survival of the, yeah. So if there was an inferior race, they'd be dead.
They would just die of their own accord.
Yeah.
You didn't have to expedite the process, as it were.
So if they're living and they're surviving, technically they're not inferior in their environment.
Right. And so I think that there's an element of correctness in that. And Darwin himself would never have proposed this, and he doesn't propose eugenics. That it's a later development.
Yeah.
And so it's called social Darwinism, not Darwinism. And there are those today who would adhere to Darwinism that are going to not be very happy with the idea of advancing these or deciding what is, but the human nature itself will determine what that is. I'm just saying that in Conrad's day, and certainly thereafter, the social application of Darwinism is a real thing. And eugenics movements is a real thing. And it's all over Europe and North America, including in Canada. And so they will sterilize homosexuals and criminals and people with diseases, with mental health issues. They'll be sterilized so that they can't reproduce for the sake of eugenics. And it's to eradicate problems. So what do? You treat people as if they weren't people. And eugenics, which you might regard as horrifying, I regard as horrifying, was condemned as a war crime after the Second World War. And now it's come back with a vengeance, because eugenics is everywhere.
How do you have eugenics in your society and also have like basic human rights? Do
I
they
don't
have
know.
Human rights in those places?
I don't know. Because human rights ought to be something that's something that does not admit of change or variation. It's something that is there. I'm not even, maybe the phrase is the wrong phrase, human rights. But you would think there's a radical conflict there between the project of eugenics and human rights. You sense the conflict, and so do I. But eugenics exists in our day as a live project, and people are generally favorable to it. Yes? So you also think there's an ethical, not just a problem, but a fundamental contradiction. Yeah. Well, I think there are contradictions in Darwinist thinking, full stop. Darwinism is a form of naturalism. Naturalism denies reasoning. And so it's fundamentally irrational, and therefore Darwinism is irrational. So it's, as a scientific theory, it doesn't even hold. But never mind. Because it just says there are forces, natural forces that create a certain outcome, and we can't understand them. It just happens. I think, well, in which case, where did you get the theory from? And how can we judge? How can we verify or falsify the theory? If everything is rooted, even our thinking, we're thinking that we're thinking, we're not really thinking. We're feeling like we're thinking, we're not really thinking. Well, in which case your conclusions, how will you know if they're valid or not? I think it's a really silly scientific theory in that sense, just on a logical level. But he doesn't get into that here. He is talking about how the power that is given to the European powers, and in particular the company from Belgium that goes there, they go for the purposes of getting ivory. That's the whole aim there. It's to extract ivory, which is used for cultural purposes back in Europe. So it's used on the one hand for piano keys, and on the other hand for dice and for dominoes and so forth. So for games, So from the trivial to from low culture to high culture, if you will, for entertainment, and yet they're doing so without any ethical restraint. They're going down there, and one of the things that Marlow notes with some disgust is the terrible inefficiency of the process. Like they're blowing up things, and they seem blowing up hills all over the place for no apparent reason. So he's surprised, and I think somewhat horrified, that it isn't as planned as he would like. And then he finally meets Kurtz. Let's see if I can come to this section. I'm just going to run this in the background. And so in part 2, I'll read a little bit. One evening, as I was lying on the deck of my steamboat, I heard voices approaching, and there were the nephew and the uncle strolling along the bank. I laid my head on my arm again, and had nearly lost myself in a doze when somebody said in my ear, as it were, "I am as harmless as a little child, but I don't like to be dictated to. Am I the manager or am I not?" I was ordered to send him there. It's incredible. I became aware that the two were standing on the shore alongside the forepart of the steamboat, just below my head. I did not move. It did not occur to me to move. I was sleepy. "It is unpleasant," grunted the uncle. "He has asked the administration to be sent there," said the other, with the idea of showing what he could do. And I was instructed accordingly. Look at the influence that man must have. Is it not frightful? They both agreed it was frightful. Then made several bizarre remarks. Make rain and fine weather. One man. The council. By the nose. Bits of absurd sentences that got the better of my drowsiness, so that I had pretty near the whole of my wits about me when the uncle said, "The climate may do away with this difficulty for you. Is he alone there?" "Yes," answered the manager. He sent his assistant down the river with a note to me in these terms: "Clear this poor devil out of the country and don't bother sending more of that sort. I'd rather be alone than have the kind of men you can dispose of with me." It was more than a year ago. Can you imagine such impudence? "Anything since then?" asked the other hoarsely. "Ivory," jerked the nephew. "Lots of it. Prime sort. Lots. Most annoying. From him." "And with that?" questioned the heavy rumble. "Invoice," was the reply, fired out, so to speak, then silence. They'd been talking about Kurtz. So Kurtz has become a bit of a tyrant, and because of his ability to get ivory, and he does it because he lacks any moral compass. He's willing to basically do whatever it takes to get the ivory. He's now not only treating the people of the Africans, the natives, with grave disrespect, he's also doing it to the members of the company. And he's allowed to do it because the company, once again, wants the ivory, and they don't care about the ethics of it. So there's a complicity of the company, and at the same time, remember that the company is not unaware of what's going on there, in the sense that anybody that goes there comes back dead. But as long as they get their ivory. So again, there's a sense that they are, because of the geographical distance, that they're not involved in the ethical problems there, but they are aware that people are dying, and they don't care about how anything comes about as long as the ivory comes back. So there's Brussels is called a whitewashed sepulcher, which is how Jesus described the Pharisees. So it's not just a light term. This is the most scathing term that Jesus uses of people in the whole New Testament. So they appear enlightened, but in fact, this is the place. This is the heart of darkness. Arguably, it's in Brussels. And Kurtz, who is the means of doing this, is to some degree horrified in the end when he dies by what he does. But up until that point, he's more exhilarated by the power that he has. And that's what when we first come across him and hear about him, this is what Marlow likes about him as well, is the sheer commitment to efficiency and willingness to get the job done. He really admires this man. So let me go down river a bit. But the terrific inefficiency of what goes on in Africa certainly strikes him. And then they are down 1.5 miles below Kurtz's station. And he's looking down at the sounding pole. Let me see, so he's trying to see how deep the water is. And gosh, it's so hard to find the passages here. I want to come to the section where, I think it's section 3. Is this correct? Yes, because there's a manager who admires Mr. Kurtz as well. And where is it? And the Russian, and let me pick it up there. There it is. It's I don't know the page, so let's see. It's because I have a different version than yours there. 1679 is mine, so I believe it is 46 pages in. 46.
From part 2?
No, from the very beginning. Yeah. Dark human shapes could be made out in the distance. Flitting indistinctly against the gloomy border of the forest, and near the river, 2 bronze figures, leaning on tall spears, stood in the sunlight under fantastic headdresses of spotted skins, warlike and still in statuesque fake repose. And from right to left, along the lighted shore, moved a wild and gorgeous apparition of a woman. She walked with measured steps, draped in striped and fringed cloths, treading the ground or the earth proudly with a slight jingle and flash of barbarous ornaments. She carried her head high. Her hair was done in the shape of a helmet. She had brass leggings to the knee, brass wire gauntlets to the elbow, a crimson spot on her tawny cheek, innumerable necklaces of glass beads on her neck, bizarre things, charms, gifts of witchmen that hung about her, glittered and trembled at every step. She must have had the value of several elephant tusks upon her. She was savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent. There was something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress. And in the hush that had fallen suddenly upon the whole sorrowful land, the immense wilderness, the colossal body of the fecund and mysterious life seemed to look at her, pensive as though it had been looking at the image of its own tenebrous and passionate soul. So who is this woman? This is Kurtz's beloved. So a local African woman who is Kurtz's, I don't know about wife, but I don't know, mistress. And she has a certain, and the problem here is that he has come to get Kurtz, and the natives don't want him to go to take him away because they regard him as a god. And so at first they attack him. And then eventually that moves away to other things.
Sorry, who comes to get Kurtz?
Marlow.
Oh, Marlo comes to get him, but then the people don't want to take him.
He's attacked, yes.
Oh, okay.
And he hears for the first time. At this moment, I heard Kurtz's deep voice behind the curtain. Save me! Save the ivory, you mean? Don't tell me. Save me! Why, I've had to save you. You are interrupting my plans now. Sick, sick. Not so sick as you would like to believe. Never mind. I'll carry my ideas out yet. I will return. Got the page number?
Yeah, 1742.
1742, thank you.
Second paragraph from the bottom here.
I'll show you what can be done. You with your little peddling notions, you are interfering with me. I will return. The manager came out. He did me the honor to take me under the arm and lead me aside. He is very low, he said. He considered it necessary to sigh, but neglected to be consistently sorrowful. We've done it all we could for him, haven't we? But there's no disguising the fact. Mr. Kurtz has done more harm than good to the company. He did not see the time was not ripe for vigorous action. Cautiously, that's my principle. We must be cautious yet. The district is closed to us for a time. Deplorable. Upon the whole, the trade will suffer. I don't deny there's a remarkable quantity of ivory, mostly fossil. We must save it at all events. But look how precarious the position is. And why? Because the method is unsound. Do you, said I, looking at the shore, call it unsound method? Without doubt, he exclaimed hotly. Don't you? No method at all, I murmured after a while. Exactly, he exulted. I anticipated this. Shows a complete want of judgment. It's my duty to point it out in the proper quarter. Oh, said I. That fellow, what's his name? The brickmaker, will make a readable report for you. He appeared confounded for a moment, it seemed to me. I had never breathed in an atmosphere so vile, and I turned mentally to Kurtz for relief, positively for relief. Nevertheless, I think Mr. Kurtz is a remarkable man, I said with an emphasis. He started, dropped on me a cold, heavy glance, said very quietly, he was, and turned his back on me. My hour of favor was over. I found myself lumped along with Kurtz as a partisan of methods for which the time was not ripe. I was unsound. But it was something to have at least a choice of nightmares. So comment here. What's the problem with Kurtz from the manager's perspective? Did he do something unethical? No. Untimely. There's nothing wrong with putting natives' heads on posts, which he's done, and killing to get there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not the right time to do that. And as a result, he's imperiled the efficiency of extracting the ivory, although there's a lot of ivory here, and we do have to get that, but he's imperiled. And furthermore, he's about to die. So we have to do something different. But there's no moral judgment on Kurtz's activities made by the manager. And that, in and of itself, is Conrad's way of alerting the reader to the lack of a moral compass amongst the two conversation partners here. So the manager has no moral scruples at all, any more than Kurtz did, and any more than Marlow does, actually. None of them are morally trustworthy. Marlow admires Kurtz because of his willingness to do what needs to be done. He admires him as you would an explorer. He goes and does things that no one else will do. So he's just like he was when he was a little boy, and he looked at the map and said, I want to go there. Here's a man who has gone to the place where the people in Brussels send him, but he has the guts to do it. So he admires this. He's a fellow adventurer. Yes?
It doesn't seem like he admires him perfectly. Like,
no.
It's almost like he has this...
There's a little bit of ambiguity or conflict there.
It seems like he's almost describing him as something awesome, but like a villain still.
Yes.
I don't know how much evidence there is for that maybe Marlow actually thinks he's a bad guy, but because of all the things he's doing, he can't necessarily...
So this is one of the challenges for the reader in reading Marlow's comments is how are we to understand Marlow here? Are we we can't be totally sympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
We also can't be totally hostile. There's a sort of a vagueness there, and it's exploring the psychology of somebody who's attracted to power, or if, as Tolkien puts it, the ring of power, and by getting close to it, he is being corrupted. Somewhat horrified, and as he gets closer, he becomes less and less horrified. As he gets further distance from Western civilization, he gets more and more lost. Although having said that, he was lost in the midst of Brussels as well. So where is the goodness in the novel? I'm not quite sure. Because if you take Brussels, the whitewashed sepulchre, to be the heart of darkness, which it could be, or is it the human heart? Or is it in Kurtz's heart? Because this is one of the famous passages here when Kurtz finally dies. Let me comment. No.
I guess it's about the ending. So I don't know if I should withhold it for later.
Just a little bit, yes, but yes. So the ending is further problematic. So when he finally meets the intended, so the one he's actually engaged to, not the mistress in Africa, but the lady he's supposed to be betrothed to. What does he say to that lady?
His last words were
Her name. The last words were your name.
But if you really saw Kurtz as, like, I guess, totally saw Kurtz as an admirable figure, and what he did as good and efficient, you'd have no reason to lie to her.
No. So again, the question is, why does he say that? What does it say about his character? Is he going to be committed to being a hypocrite? Is that what it's all about? Is that the easier path? Like, why does he give that answer? It's a funny old answer.
Or is that him recognizing that there's things more important than efficiency?
Right. So it's a good response in that sense. But we don't really get the sense that he is totally turning against himself either. Yeah, it ends with an element of ambiguity at any rate. Flip over the page, and let's look at the dialogue between Kurtz and Marlo, if I can find it. May flip over another page. There it is. So I don't know, I'm gonna have to read from it, and then you'll be able to pick it up for me. The paragraph begins with, "Sometimes he was contemptibly childish." Right at the beginning of it, it's a paragraph about 10 lines long. "Sometimes he was contemptibly childish. He desired to have kings meet him at railway stations on his return from some ghastly nowhere, where he intended to accomplish great things." Got the page?
1748.
1748. "You show them you have in you something that is really profitable, and then there will be no limits to the recognition of your ability," he would say. "Of course, you must take care of the motives. Right motives, always. The long reaches that were like one and the same reach, monotonous bends that were exactly alike, slip past the steamer with their multitude of secular trees, looking patiently after this grimy fragment of another world, the forerunner of change, of conquest, of trade, of massacres, of blessings. I looked ahead, piloting. 'Close the shutter,' said Kurtz suddenly one day. I can't bear to look at this." I did so. There was a silence. "Oh, but I will wring your heart yet," he cried at the invisible wilderness. So this is by the way, this is the final moments of Kurtz's life, and he's dying, and he's defiant of the wilderness in which he finds himself in the midst. So it's a jungle, it's a forbidding landscape. It's still called a wilderness. It's not been tamed. So it's almost a battle between him and nature. And he'd appeared like he had dominated it all, and now he's losing. "We broke down, as I'd expected, and had to lie up for repairs at the head of an island. This delay was the first thing that shook Kurtz's confidence. One morning he gave me a packet of papers and a photograph, the lot tied together with a shoestring. 'Keep this for me,' he said. this noxious fool, meaning the manager, is capable of prying into my boxes when I am not looking. In the afternoon, I saw him. He was lying on his back with closed eyes, and I withdrew quietly. But I heard him mutter, "Live rightly, die, die." I listened. There was nothing more. Was he rehearsing some speech in his sleep, or was it a fragment of a phrase from some newspaper article? He'd been writing for the papers and meant to do so again. Quote, "For the furthering of my ideas. It's a duty." End quote. His was an impenetrable darkness. I looked at him as you peer down at a man who is lying at the bottom of a precipice where the sun never shines. So this was interesting now. So at the end of his life, he is in the dark, portrayed to be in the dark. In what sense is it dark? Is it because he can't physically see, or is there a existential sense of darkness here? And I think it's the latter. He's lying at the bottom of a precipice where the sun never shines. But I had not much time to give him because I was helping the engine driver to take to pieces the leaky cylinders, to straighten a bent connecting rod, and in other such matters. I lived in an infernal mess of rust, filings, nuts, bolts, spanners, hammers, ratchet drills, things I abominate because I don't get on with them. I tended the little forge we fortunately had aboard. I toiled wearily in a wretched scrap heap, unless I had the shakes too bad to stand. One evening came in with a candle. I was startled to hear him say a little tremulously, "I am lying here in the dark, waiting for death." The light was within a foot of his eyes. I forced myself to murmur, "Oh, nonsense," and stood over him as if transfixed. Anything approaching the change that came over his features I have never seen before, and hope never to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw on that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried in a whisper at some image, at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. I blew the candle out and left the cabin. The pilgrims were dining in the mess room, and I took my place opposite the manager, who lifted his eyes to give me a look. A questioning glance, which I successfully ignored. He leaned back, serene, with that peculiar smile of his, sealing the unexpressed depths of his meanness. A continual shower of small flies steamed upon the lamp, upon the cloth, upon our hands and faces. Suddenly the manager's boy put his insolent black head in the doorway and said in a tone of scathing contempt, "Mr. Kurtz, he dead." All the pilgrims rushed out to see. I remained and went on with my dinner. I believe I was considered brutally callous. However, I did not eat much. There was a lamp in there, light, don't you know, and outside it was so beastly dark. I went no more near the remarkable man who had pronounced a judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. The voice was gone. What else had there been? But I am, of course, aware that the next day the pilgrims buried something in a muddy hole. And then they very nearly buried me. So I'll stop it there. Really interesting passage for all sorts of reasons. And the reference to the darkness, the reference to the light of the candle, so he's in darkness and he can't even see him. So I read a fair bit from that passage. He can't even see them at the bottom of a precipice where the sun never shines. So he can't see him, and neither can Kurtz see in the dark, even when the candle's right in front of him. it's not a reference to the physical darkness, clearly. It's a reference to something about the darkness of his soul, his sense of, well, all of them were described. On his ivory face, and that's an interesting descriptor as well. Somber pride, ruthless power, craven terror, and intense and hopeless despair. It's almost like he's looking into the abyss of nothingness, where there's no moral. So he's acting as if there's no moral. He has no moral nature. And now that he's coming to the end of his time, compare and contrast this with the death of Ivan Illich. How does he the black bag? Now we have the blackness at the bottom of the precipice, which he can't see in. How does he greet his death compared to Ivan's experience of death? And why is there a difference between the two? Well, for one thing, there's no sense of a power pushing him into it. It just is happening. Like there's no sense of agency, right? In Death of Ivan Illich, there's no word God, there's no person, but he still has the sense of being pushed, and that word pushed will have a personal, people push you, or at least something animate pushes you. I guess your dog could push you with his head or something like that. But there's something pushing him, or someone, and that's not here. There's a total abandonment of there's nothing around him. He's acted like a nihilist. He's annihilated his own moral nature. He's annihilated everybody else's human nature, and now he looks into the horror of that abyss, and he is finally horrified with what he sees, because he doesn't see anything. There's nothing there. And the response of that from everyone around him is particularly interesting. Marlow, who admired him, is, to put it mildly, unimpressed. Blows out the candle. He's annoyed. Or what is it? I'm not even sure how to describe it. The manager's boy is contemptuous because he's dead. Why contemptuous? That's a strange response. You wouldn't normally be contemptuous of somebody's death. It would seem to be an inappropriate response. Why is he contemptuous? Any thoughts? It's not just contempt, it's scathing contempt. Why would he have such a response? Sure.
Maybe, he's the manager's son, so maybe the manager, told him not to feel anything. Maybe his dad told him, just go and let me know when you
Oh no, the manager's boy, I don't think it refers to his son. I think it refers to a servant or something like that. I think.
Well, still, he could have been told by his master or whatever, just not to feel anything, just go in and tell him he's dead. And for the sake of not wanting to get in trouble, he called.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's possible.
Is he an African boy?
That's what I thought.
Yes, because it's probably, it could be that this guy is their new savior, this Kurtz.
I think that's it. They thought he was a god.
Yeah.
And now he's dead. He's just like one of us. And he's disgusted by it. Up to this point, they'd revered him and treated him like a god. And he had not even very happy to let them continue on under that illusion.
Also, he didn't like it, how they were treating him like that?
No, he was fine with it. This is a god, after all. So, of course, they can do whatever they want with us. If they're gods and we're men, that's fine. But now that he's revealed himself to be just a man, he's disgusted with the fact that his idol has proved himself to be no god at all.
Marlo.
No, well, Marlow is also disgusted, but not quite in the same way as the manager's boy.
But Marlo doesn't seem surprised.
No, he's not surprised, and he's also rather contemptuous as well. Not quite to the degree of the manager's boy, who is, as I say, scathing contempt, but Marlow is just, oh, nonsense. Because he's upset that at the end, he's terrified. He expected him to greet death and to look it in the face and spit in its face, but in the end, he's just a terrified human being in the dark. And Marlow is being disabused of his esteem for Kurtz, who he thought was a better man than anyone else. And now he sees that he dies just like every other man. Right? Well, at least that's... We're left guessing, and to some degree this is one of the reasons Conrad's novel is so good, is that it does reveal psychology quite well, I think. And even more so than revealing the character's psychology, it asks us where we stand in relation to the characters as well. So we don't just accept the narrative, we're supposed to be troubled by what we read and question where we stand in relation to all this as well. But note that the others are called the pilgrims that rushed out to sea. The pilgrimage, you get pilgrimage to a holy site. What's the holy site? Well, it's his body. And note how Marlow describes it. The next day the pilgrims buried something in a muddy hole. Well, what did they bury?
His body.
His body, but he doesn't even call it a body. He can't. They buried something in a muddy hole.
Well, it's also because he wasn't there. He didn't go. He wasn't
I know, but he knows what it was, but he couldn't even bring himself to describe the dead body because he can't admit that that's what's happened, because he'd idealized Kurtz. He met the man and he had this image of what he would be like, but he found him sick, and he found him far less powerful than he had expected him to be. In fact, he was disgusted by the end of his life, because he himself wanted to be like Kurtz. He saw himself like Kurtz, so he's disgusted that the aim of being godlike has failed for Kurtz, and by implication, perhaps for him, and he hates that. Because he's an idealist, he's a man of the sea, he's an explorer. He's a humanitarian. He wants to go where no one else has ever been. He wanted that from a very young age.
But he didn't seem to want it in the same way Kurtz.
No, he didn't. No. In what way was he different?
Kurtz wanted ivory,
Yes?
and he saw that as his goal, and that was the only thing that was important for
Right.
him in his whole life.
Right.
Whereas Marlow seems to have a lot more humanity and is relating to the characters. He has this whole narrative where he's talking about the cannibals not eating, and he thinks about how, wow, they're pretty impressive to not eat, and just he seems to appreciate the adventure and things going on in the story, where Kurtz is just focused on, let's get me out of here.
So in speaking back to Chinua Achebe's account then, he actually seems to be ascribing cannibals greater humanity than the Europeans are capable of there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're cannibals and there are people to eat, and they're not eating them.
Mm-hmm.
So they have there's some sort of moral rationale on you can eat these people, you can't eat these people, and they're not willing to do it just because they're hungry. So they don't eat because they're hungry, they eat for some other reason.
And they're literally starving.
And they're literally starving, but they're unwilling to eat a person, even though they're cannibals.
And even though Kurtz is killing people left
And he's killing people left, right, and center, and he would never eat anyone. So again, the moral, the differences are being explored by Marlow, and he's doing so, don't want to say neutrally, but he's not biased, and he's not on one side or the other. He's being fair in his
well, that's like when he's trying
account.
to figure it out.
He's
Whereas
trying to figure it
Kurtz
out.
Never was.
Kurtz doesn't care. No, he's ruthless in his efficiency. That's why Marlow admires him. But he's not quite like him. He just wants to be like him.
But does he want to be like him, or does he just want to understand from the story?
Maybe. Yeah. Because he wants to understand everything he's never encountered before. He's never encountered a man like this.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the man who has put good and evil under his feet. He stands above it. What a man. He's Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch. The man on it's the word used in Austrian German apparently for the guy when you're climbing up a mountain climber, and there are two people climbing, the guy at the top, and then they hammer the spikes into the side of the mountain, and then they go up the rope. The guy on the top is the Übermensch. That's what it's referring to. But Nietzsche refers it to a person who is at the top of the ladder and is willing to be without any rope. So the humanitarians that advance ahead of the rest of civilization, how? by putting moral restraints beneath their feet and not regarding them. Those apply to other men, not to me. So they're beyond good and evil. That becomes the ideology of Nazism. Because they're the Übermensch, the German people, at least according to Hitler. Yes?
Were you comparing the Übermensch to Marlow, or?
Kurtz, but Marlow seems to admire Kurtz because he seems to be that sort of figure that is able to put, he's not like him. He really seems to be capable of acting totally amorally, not immorally, but amorally, as if there's no moral boundaries on anything. It's just this ruthless commitment to efficiency, which he sees as the way in which his culture is advanced on, let's say, the Romans. When they came to Britain, he said they just plundered, they grabbed things while they were there, but they weren't really committed to doing it. The tendency towards empire wasn't total domination of all of life, it was just getting some stuff. Whereas here the commitment is total. We're going to dominate utterly, including our own nature and including all morality. Whereas the Romans had a code of conduct, they had laws and they followed them. And the rule of law does not apply here in the jungle.
I see Kurtz more as like a nihilist than a because he doesn't really have any moral code. I think the Kurtz is supposed to have some
No,
moral code.
no, he's beyond that. He has his own moral code, that's
He's like
it.
setting the moral code.
He's setting the moral code, but the moral code is to have no moral code. The standards that apply to everyone else don't apply to him. He's the future. So he's at the top of the evolutionary ladder. So if you're wondering how things are going to evolve, here's how it's going to be according to Nietzsche. It's to get beyond good and evil. Those are cultural constructs. They don't apply to him. The Übermensch. And I think Kurtz acts that way as well. Now, you're right. In the end, the result of that vantage point is nihilism. And culturally, the result of the Nietzschean being beyond good and evil is nihilism in European thought. In the mid-20th century, nihilism becomes a real thing. And so Kurtz goes from being a guy who thinks that he is all powerful and under no constraint whatsoever to being in total darkness and despair. Yes?
Why didn't he just kill himself?
Well, in the end, I'm not sure he was able to do that, but that's a good question. Well, to the very end, people thought that he was a god. Other than the manager at the end, but even the manager's boy thought that he was. But the manager had some sense that he was dying, and there was a smirk there of self-satisfaction because he's not as superior as we thought he was, and he acted as if he was. And so the manager is lifting his eyes in a questioning glance, but the questioning glance is, huh? Did he die? And his boy, who comes in, is full of scathing contempt because he thought that he was a god. He admired him, or revered him, rather. And Marlow, for that matter, when he met him and saw what a state he was in, he didn't even want to acknowledge that it was happening. And then they buried something the next day, the pilgrims. What's his body? Well, so he doesn't even want to associate that body with the figure he revered. So all of them respond in a way that denies the reality of who this man was. And they don't know what he was even. The only person who relates to him as a man is his intended back home. She remembers him before he went into the Congo. Yes?
In the movie, does it depict it like exactly kind of like this too?
No, well, you have to watch it.
Oh.
It doesn't, it has to play with it a bit, right? And it's a 2-hour movie, so it's not going to go into all the depths and details of this, but yes.
A question a little earlier. I think I'm confused with what's going to happen in the middle when he steals the shoes. Whose shoes does he take?
Who steals the shoes?
No.
Kurtz.
is it Kurtz who takes the shoes?
I don't think so.
When at the boat, I thought it was Marlo himself that took the shoes. When the guy dies, when
Yes,
they put it in.
yes. So why is that confusing?
I think that when I was reading through it, I thought that was Kurtz. And
That
then-
stole the shoes. Oh gosh.
No, I think I thought it had been Kurtz's shoes he took.
Oh, I think you might be right.
But I don't understand what happened in the narrative then, because he throws that man off the boat. Does he throw Kurtz off the boat?
No,
No.
no. After he dies here?
No.
Before that? No, he doesn't throw
Before
Kurtz
that,
off the
like in
boat.
the
No, no,
second-
no.
This is way back in the.
Yeah, no, that doesn't happen.
So that's just a random.
Body, yeah, random, yeah.
Okay.
Which is what soldiers will do on the battlefield.
Mhm.
You're not going to need those. Look like about the right size. They'll take weapons and shoes and whatever. Let's come to the conclusion then, because I think that, as you say, is quite interesting. Not that far off it. And he goes back to meet the intended, and he's left Marlow with, remember, a stack of letters and so forth, and trusted to them because he doesn't trust the manager not to go through them, but he does trust Marlow because he realized that Marlow reveres him in some way, and the manager, he knows, does not. There's a clear antipathy between them, but there's something a little different there, and that's part of the reason why Marlow is a little bit suspect as a narrator, because surely he should regard this man as contemptible and immoral, but he remains sympathetic to him in some ways. Let me pick it up. No, where? Let's just flip the page, and I think there it's more or less there. I was left at last with a slim packet of letters and the girl's portrait. Thus I was left at last. She struck me as beautiful. I mean, she had a beautiful expression. I know that the sunlight can be made to lie too, yet one felt that no manipulation of light and pose could have conveyed the delicate shade of truthfulness upon those features. She seemed ready to listen without mental reservation, without suspicion, without a thought for herself. You know what's interesting about this? He looks at the face and he is imagining all sorts of things and connecting them with the face. So she's truthful. So he's idolizing the woman. He says that, first of all, she struck me as beautiful, and then he corrects himself. I mean, she had a beautiful expression. Well, maybe she is beautiful, I don't know. And the movie could make her a beautiful woman or not, but he corrects this. And then he said, I know that the sunlight can be made to lie too. Now that's an interesting phrase as well, because we've just seen how darkness has been played on and light has been played on. And the light can be made to lie too, in the sense that even things that appear to be proper, like Brussels, can be whitewashed sepulchres. So he's making moral judgments here. But she, on the other hand, seemed ready to listen, without mental reservation, without suspicion, without a thought for herself. I concluded I would go and give her back her portrait and those letters myself. Curiosity? Yes. And also some other feeling, perhaps. All that had been Kurtz's had passed out of my hands. His soul, his body, his station, his plans, his ivory, his career. There remained only his memory and his intended. And I wanted to give that up, too, to the past, in a way. To surrender personally all that remained of him with me to that oblivion which is the last word of our common fate. I don't defend myself. I had no clear perception of what it was I really wanted. Perhaps it was an impulse of unconscious loyalty, or the fulfillment of one of those ironic necessities that lurk in the facts of human existence. I don't know, I can't tell, but I went. I thought his memory was like the other memories of the dead that accumulate in every man's life, a vague impress on the brain of shadows that had fallen on it in their swift and final passage. But before the high and ponderous door, between the tall houses of a street, as still and decorous as a well-kept alley in a cemetery, I had a vision of him on the stretcher, opening his mouth voraciously, as if to devour all the earth with all its mankind. He lived then before me. He lived as much as he'd ever lived, a shadow, insatiable of splendid appearances, of frightful realities, a shadow darker than the shadow of the night, and draped nobly in the folds of a gorgeous eloquence. This vision seemed to enter the house with me. The stretcher, the phantom bearers, the wild crowd of obedient worshippers, the gloom of the forest, the glitter of the reach beyond the murky bends, the beat of the drum, regular and muffled like the beating of the heart of a conquering darkness. It was a moment of triumph for the wilderness, an invading and vengeful rush, which, it seemed to me, I would have to keep back alone for the salvation of another soul. So what's going on here? What is Marlowe's relation to Kurtz in these, as he's going back to bring the belongings of Kurtz to the Beloved? How would you describe Marlowe's mindset here? Any thoughts? And what's with the shadows and the darkness? He goes on, I remembered his abject pleading, his abject threats, the colossal scale of his vile desires, the meanness, the torment, the tempestuous anguish of his soul. And later on, I seemed to see his collected, languid manner, which he said one day, this lot of ivory now is really mine. The company did not pay for it. I collected it myself at a very great personal risk. I am afraid they will try to claim it as theirs alone. It is a difficult case. What do you think I ought to do? Resist, eh? I want no more than justice. What's going on here? And then these words, the horror, which he repeats more than once here. He keeps coming back. The words are haunting him. He's thinking about the man Kurtz, his life and the manner of his death, and he talks about it as a shadow that accompanies him as he goes back to bring these belongings to the Beloved. What do you think Marlow, or Conrad rather, is trying to do in the manner of the depiction? Any thoughts?
Is he dying himself?
Is he dying?
He says the horror. He's like, what's dead?
Kurtz did, yes. But are you saying Marlow is also dying?
In a sense? Maybe not physically? Something morally?
What would be dying then? His soul? That would make sense of his delivering the documents to her, I think, and then lying to her about his last words.
He seems like he's going crazy.
You think so?
He's kind of like talking to himself and like debating what he should do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer to my question here. It's hard to figure out what's going on. Did you have a sense of it?
I mean, I saw this section as him just processing everything that he thinks about Kurtz. Like, it starts off by saying, like, it wasn't like how when a normal person dies and it's just kind of like a vague impression. Like, he still has all these things he's trying to work through, the amazing things that Kurtz did and the awful things. And I think he's kind of deciding how he's going to talk to this woman.
Okay, so he's playing over his mind his good attributes and the evil attributes. And,
Yeah, I think he's still just...
and the manner of his death, the horror, and he still can't fathom it himself.
I think this is like him processing all of that.
I think you're right. We're given something here of what we don't really see in earlier works is something of an inner, like a conscience, trying to process, as you say, but there's also a moral reckoning of it.
Yeah.
And he meets her, and says to the beloved, intimacy grows quickly out there. I said, I knew him as well as it is possible for one man to know another. And you admired him, she said. It was impossible to know him and not to admire him. Was it? He was a remarkable man, I said unsteadily. Then, before the appealing fixity of her gaze that seemed to watch for more words on my lips, I went on, it was impossible not to love him. She finished eagerly, silencing him into an appalled dumbness. How true, how true. But when you think that no one knows him so well as I had all his noble confidence. I knew him best. You knew him best, I repeated, and perhaps she did. But with every word spoken, the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and white, remained illumined by the unextinguishable light of belief and love. You were his friend, she went on. His friend, she repeated a little louder. You must have been if he had given you this and sent you to me. I feel I can speak to you, and oh, I must speak. I want you, you who have heard his last words, to know I have been worthy of him. It is not pride. Yes, I am proud to know I understood him better than anyone on earth. He told me so himself, and since his mother died, I've had no one to... I listened. The darkness deepened, etc. So, again, what's going on here? The darkness is deepening as he listens to her admire him. In Marlo's experience, the darkness is deepening. What darkness? Why is it getting darker? And why in the end does he lie to her? What were his last words? Your name. His last word, to live with, she insisted. Don't you understand? I loved him, I loved him, I loved him. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was, your name. I heard a light sigh, and then my heart stood still, stopped dead short by an exulting and terrible cry, by the cry of inconceivable triumph and of unspeakable pain. I knew it. I was sure. She knew. She was sure. I heard her weeping. She had hidden her face in her hands. It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I could escape, that the heavens would fall upon my head. But nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen, I wonder, if I'd rendered Kurtz that justice which was his due? Hadn't he said he wanted only justice? But I couldn't. I could not tell her. It would have been too dark altogether. Marlow ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent. Now he's back on the boat where he's been telling the whole story, right? Like a Buddha. And so in the end he lies. He lies, why? Is this the civilized thing to do? I guess it is. He tells her what she wants to hear. He guessed.
Is he keeping her from falling into darkness?
And he's falling into darkness in the process. Because he's lying. But he's made a moral judgment to do so, to keep the truth from her. I don't have answers here. I do say that it is an interesting exploration of civilization and its boundaries and the effect of power on human nature and all of those things. It's a mysterious novella, and I don't think we're going to exhaust its meaning in 2 talks, but it concludes, and the very last line, the offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. That's how it concludes. What is the heart of darkness? It's called that, and there's a lot of darkness, and even in the end.
Is there an example?